BernhardSchulz, AICA, Germany. Today I'm speaking about Documenta 15, the story of a scandal and what it means for art criticism. Introduction. For 100 days, from 18 June to 25th September of 2022, the 15th edition of Documenta took place in Kassel. The D15, like none of its predecessors, generated a veritable flood of reports and commentary in Germany, and international attention was also considerable. But the interest was less in the art exhibited than in the scandal, triggered first by one contribution and later by other works with overtly anti-Semitic content. The Documenta organizers' demonstrative unwillingness to address the problem of anti-Semitism, especially in Germany, with its special history, was what made the scandal so big. In the following, I will briefly explain the history and significance of the Documenta. In the second section, I will summarize the scandal of the D15. Thirdly, I will talk about a development of contemporary art that became visible in the Documenta, before I explain the specificity of Israel criticism and anti-Semitism in Germany in the fourth section. Finally, I will make some conclusions for the future of art criticism. Chapter 1. For decades, the Documenta has been considered one of the world's most important exhibitions of contemporary art. It was held for the first time in 1955, at the time intended as a one-off event. The organizer of the planned art exhibition, Arnold Bode, wanted to take advantage of the peripheral location of Kassel to take up modern art, which had been ostracized under National Socialism without regard to a local art or academy tradition. The first Documenta, conceived as a museum of 100 days, brought together a number of artists who had been harassed under the Nazi regime and whose work had been confiscated in the degenerate art campaign and denounced as examples of decaying art. By linking up with modernism before 1933, the West German present visibly distanced itself from the cultural barbarism of the Nazi era. The Documenta became a kind of founding event of West German post-war art. Therein lies its continuing significance. 4 years later, a second Documenta was organized. In 1959, the aim was no longer to present modernism that had already become classical, but to show the art of the immediate present and thereby to link West German art with the international art of the West. The success of the second Documenta also made this art exhibition a permanent institution. Participation in the Documenta became a seal of quality, and the Documenta increasingly became a factor in the international art market, all the more so because the respective artistic directors enjoyed a high reputation as independent authorities. The Documenta directors Harald Seemann, Rudi Fuchs and Jan Huth are just a few examples. Over the years, the appointments have reflected trends in the art scene. In 1997, for example, the French Catherine David was the first woman to be appointed, and in 2002 Ogwoy Enwezor was the first black person. The selection of an artist collective to head Documenta 15 was a novelty. The fact that the Indonesian collective Ruang Rupa was chosen underscores the intention of those responsible at Documenta to take a non-Western perspective into account when selecting the director. At this point, it is necessary to ask about the Ruang Rupa collective. In the manual of Documenta 15, no fewer than 27 names are listed under the heading Ruang Rupa and Artistic Team. Only at the end of the book does one learn that Ruang Rupa consists of only 9 members. The lack of clarity was obviously intentional. All individuals were to become invisible behind the collective. 66 names are listed as participants, mostly but not exclusively from collectives. Second, the course of the scandal. Several months before the opening of Documenta, fears had already been voiced that the Indonesian collective Ruang Rupa was close to or tolerated the anti-Israeli boycott movement BDS. In addition, it was spread that no Jewish and/or Israeli artists were represented among the numerous artists invited to the Documenta. Finally, the day of the preview had arrived with a press conference on 15th June. The journalists did not ask any questions about Israel, anti-Semitism and BDS. The preview went without conflict. It was only when Federal President Steinmeier spoke at the opening on 18th of June that the topic was back, as Steinmeier took up the accusation, already voiced, that no Jewish and no Israeli artists had been invited, and this in view of the number of around 1,400 artists invited to participate through the curator's snowball system. Steinmeier called this absence disturbing and stressed that Israel's right to exist should not be called into question. He had considered not coming to Kassel because of these accusations. The sharpness of this message was not quite perceived at first. The scandal broke all the more violently the following day, when the 9 by 12 meter banner of the collective Taring Padi entitled People's Justice was unveiled on Friedrichsplatz in front of the Documenta's traditional main building, the Fridericianum. The multi-figured image featured a figure with temple curls and bloodshot eyes, wearing headgear decorated with SS runes in the manner of a Jewish hat prescribed in the past in various European countries, and next to him a soldier with a pig's head, Star of David, and the name of the Israeli Secret Service Mossad on his helmet. The 20-year-old banner had not yet been hung during the preview days, ostensibly because it had needed restoration after being shipped from Indonesia. This was, however, interpreted as an admission that the anti-Semitic content had been known and deliberately concealed from the media. In the face of the rising storm of protest, the Documenta management initially only agreed to cover the banner with cloth, but had to order its removal the following day. The artists' collective's explanation that the incriminated depictions were not meant to be anti-Semitic, but rather, quote, culturally specific to our experiences during the military dictatorship in Indonesia, end of quote, was not convincing. There was a consensus in the media and the political public that anti-Semitism could not be viewed differently from country to country, but should be condemned in principle. The German management of Documenta remained almost invisible during the scandal. Even the curatorial collective Ruangrupa needed a few days to admit that it had, quote, failed to discover the anti-Semitic figures in the work, quote, end. How Ruangrupa goes about it could be read in the handbook as the collective's three main principles: organize, educate, and agitate. About their banners, the group says, quote, through striking and satirical iconography and apt striking text, these then convey political messages, end of quote. That was exactly the case here, except that the message was poorly reviewed. I'm skipping over a lot of details in the unfolding of the scandal here and focusing on the main events. At the end of June, the managing director, Ms. Schormann, went public with a long justification. It said that, quote, the artistic direction and the meanwhile 1,500 artists had already feared censorship in January after the anti-Semitism allegations arose and therefore rejected an external panel of experts. Quote, and end of quote. This was the admission that there had been no examination of the works to be exhibited. By then, other conspicuous exhibits had been named that might have anti-Semitic content. These indications came from visitors, not from the management. For example, the Palestinian group, the Question of Funding, presented paintings, including one by Mohammed al-Hawajiri, which superimposed Picasso's Guernica, as an indictment of a German war crime, with a depiction of Israeli troops. The title, Guernica Gaza, was unambiguous, the intended association of the Israeli military with the German Wehrmacht of 1937 unmistakable. Furthermore, the 1982 film footage from Lebanon shown under the title Tokyo Reels was displayed, implicitly accusing Israel of war crimes against the civilian population. The fact that these films were made available via a member of the Japanese terrorist group Red Army, presented in the handbook as, quote, a celebrated director of experimental agitprop films, end of quote, provoked protests. Finally, the drawings by the artist Boruhan Karkutli in a brochure under the title Présence des Femmes, which also had Israeli soldiers as their subject, caught the eye. The Documenta shareholders, thus going public from the German side instead of the silent artistic direction, described the brochure as archival material, not as a work of art in its own right, but conceded that, quote, a suitable contextualization was neglected, end of quote. For the duration of the documenta, new indications of possible anti-Semitic content in individual objects continued to be received. The discussion in the media shifted from the exhibition itself to the committees of the documenta institution. The statements of the curatorial collective Ruang-Rupa exhausted themselves by repeating that they had first had to become acquainted with the special situation in Germany. Ruang-Rupa rejected any responsibility for the content of the works shown in Kassel. Thus, Documenta 15 came to an end on September 25. In public, this Documenta was declared a failure, while at the same time the question of a future for the institution of Documenta remained open. To what extent the position of Documenta in the international art scene has changed or diminished cannot be said so soon after the end of the event. Third, where is the art? The incidents surrounding the banner of the collective Taring Party and then the obvious unwillingness of the Documenta management and curators to investigate anti-Semitism at the Documenta resulted in an enormous media response. What came up short, however, and almost didn't take place at all, was conventional art criticism in the sense of presenting and critically appreciating the works shown, both individually and as a whole, against the background of Ruang-Rupa's particular concept. It was apparent from the outset that this Documenta was to be different from all its predecessors. The Ruang-Rupa collective had left no doubt that it did not want to select any artworks or even have them created in Kassel itself in the true sense of the word. Instead, Ruang-Rupa placed its concept under terms such as lumbung, which in Indonesia refers to a barn for holding surplus crops for later distribution to the village community. In Kassel, lumbung was to stand for the sharing of ideas, knowledge and resources of all kinds in a broader sense. Ruang-Rupa also mentioned principles such as generosity, local anchoring, frugality or transparency. Instead of art in a conventional sense, the focus was on process, dynamics, activities, participation in general. To this end, the team invited 14 other collectives from all over the world, but primarily from what is today generally referred to as the Global South. In addition, these groups were authorized to invite artists and collectives in turn, so that in the end the number of approximately 1,400 individual artists circulated who were involved in the Documenta. Even if the inclusion of cook shops, vegetable gardens or children's play areas was not really new, their programmatic emphasis in the sense of a new concept of art was. The unspoken will to decolonize meant that investigations into the history of colonialism and oppression, whether in the former Dutch East Indies or in Algeria, were given prominent place. The question of whether the display of books and archival materials, whether this documentary approach is already sufficient to qualify as a work of art, was nowhere raised. Critics sympathetic to the concept refer to the term social sculpture, coined by Joseph Beuys and, by the way, tested not least at the Documenta, in order to interpret the political commitment as simultaneously artistic. The fact that art requires a specific aesthetic that goes beyond the documentary object was impressively demonstrated by the work of renowned Cuban artist Tania Bruguera on political persecution in her home country, but in other cases it was passed over without any comment. The weakness of the collective idea necessarily also affects collectively produced art. The fact that this Documenta took a counterposition to the concept of the artist as a creative individual was almost lost due to the political quarrels. Likewise, the question of agitprop and propaganda was hardly raised. Collectives may paint demonstration posters, but an artistic creation is a singular process, no matter how many helping hands are involved in its execution. Fourth chapter, Anti-Semitism, Israel and the Global South. The scandal caused by the depictions on the house-sized banner of Taring Party obviously surprised its creators as well as the collective Ruang-Rupa. The justification that the depictions were not meant to be anti-Semitic shows the dilemma of the different perceptions. While in Germany a historically justified sensitivity towards anti-Semitic statements and content has developed, anti-Jewish stereotypes in other countries and parts of the world are obviously not perceived as offensive or even recognized as such. The imagery of the banner shows that the question of anti-Semitism cannot be separated from the attitude towards the State of Israel. It can be assumed that Taring Party was concerned with criticism of Israeli policy. The collective stated, quote, "The imagery we use, however, was never created out of a hatred for any particular ethnic or religious group, but was intended as a critique of militarism and state violence. We regret that we have portrayed possible involvement of the government of the State of Israel in such a completely inappropriate way and sincerely apologize for this. Anti-Semitism has no place in our feelings or our thoughts." End of quote. It's about Israel, toned down in a statement to merely involvement of the government of State of Israel. Founded 3 years after the Shoah, the state is viewed as a current colonial power in many countries with colonial past, Islamic populations or both, often distorting it into the epitome of evil. Such a view makes the imagery of Taring Party plausible, for in this perspective it does not even matter whether Israel or its intelligence service were involved in the bloody events in Indonesia in the 1960s. Israel and Mossad are simply suffice for militarism and state violence. At least in Germany, statements or judgments about Israel and its policies can never be separated from the question of anti-Semitism. For art criticism, however, this means that on the subject of Israel and anti-Semitism, it takes a backseat to the fundamental condemnation of any statements that could be interpreted as anti-Semitic. The freedom of art, which has been defended time and again against any attempt of censorship, especially at the Documenta, finds its limits here, and especially in Germany. On the other hand, the consideration of artists and collectives and their works, actions and initiatives within the framework of the Documenta entails that the political and social positions of conflicts in their respective home countries are imported as it were. The debates on decolonization demonstrate this most impressively. The instruments of art criticisms, however, fail in the face of political conflicts that cannot be adequately assessed in another place. The experiences during the military dictatorship in Indonesia, cited by Taring Party, can only be noted elsewhere. The consequence is ultimately a relativism that does not further question the respective political stance of the artist or collective. What falls by the wayside is the aesthetic dimension that constitutes art in the first place. For, to use the well-known word of the painter Bernhard, art is art and everything else is everything else. Conclusion. The politicization of art has come considerably stronger in recent years in the sense of its commitment to political goals, and has put art criticism in a difficult, basically hopeless situation, where interpretation and criticism oriented towards artistic standard fails or is rejected as misguided because it does not want to follow political goals that are claimed to be good and justified. The only option is political debate. One can, for example, argue politically about colonialism and decolonization without touching the sphere of art at all. Corresponding exhibits are then evidence of the respective political intentions, but no longer works of intrinsic artistic value. In the face of this dilemma, art criticism has largely failed so far, and especially in the case of Documenta 15. It was born out of the intention to break through the mechanisms of this very art establishment and to enable a radically different perspective through the unreserved transfer of the selection of artists and artworks to a collective from a country of the global south. In this, Ruang Rupa did not disappoint those responsible for Documenta as an institution. But by turning the art exhibition into a global get-together, the group has led Documenta into a dead end. A far-reaching reorganization of Documenta is in the offing. In the same way, however, art critics are called upon to return to the field of art or to switch to the political field of commentators. Thank you.